This is Kent Mulgat with Kelowna Now, joined by Dave Brown from Kent Employment Law. Love that name.
Thank you very much, yeah.
And thanks for joining us. What we wanted to talk about is fraternization and harassment in the workplace. Now, since this whole Harvey Weinstein Me Too movement, you were saying that you've had quite the uptick in people contacting your firm with problems like this.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's a very fair comment on both sides of the spectrum here, where I've had a number of consultations with people who have felt like they're being the subject of sexual harassment in the workplace, or companies who have been faced with a complaint of some kind, either internally or before the BC Human Rights Tribunal, and are looking for some advice in defending that.
So your firm handles both ends of it?
We do, yeah. So Kent Employment Law, we specialize in employment and human rights work. So we're kind of like the legal extension of the HR department, so to speak, right? And we do have lawyers that work on both sides of the spectrum here. So a lot of our lawyers kind of work primarily with what we call plaintiffs or with workers. And then we've got other lawyers who work primarily with companies. But absolutely, we represent both sides.
So are there issues that come up when you hear these complaints that are useful for other people to hear about so that they can avoid getting into these sorts of problems? Like what sorts of things give rise to these issues?
Yeah, I think right now we're kind of going through a real societal change, I think, with how we view workplace relationships and how we view sexual harassment in the workplace. And quite frankly, I mean, this is a long time coming. I'm very happy to see that we're finally having this kind of conversation. And while a lot of the media attention is kind of focused in the United States, whether it's with very high-profile celebrities or with politicians or whomever, we are seeing this coming to Canada as well through this Me Too movement, right? Where what we're seeing is people who are uncomfortable with certain comments or with certain actions being taken place in the workplace, who may have otherwise remained silent, are now coming forward and saying, this is no longer acceptable and I'm going to be standing up for myself in dealing with this. So this is absolutely a kind of an awakening, I think, for both for workers, for women in particular, and for companies. From a company perspective, this is a real excellent opportunity to be taking out and updating your policies, if you have any, on workplace harassment and specifically sexual harassment, and also taking the opportunity to have a candid conversation with your staff about what is acceptable workplace conduct.
Okay, so when people come forward with a complaint, are they generally talking about harassment that is in the classic thing we imagine where it's a supervisor using their power in the relationship in some way, or is it just as often, people sort of in lateral positions within the company?
Yeah, we have to look at this kind of from two different perspectives. So there can be an internal complaint where somebody is dealing with a coworker and a comment is made that makes them feel uncomfortable, or there's a certain action that's uncomfortable, and then they report that to their supervisor or to their manager, expecting it to be handled internally. And my expectation is that those will be handled internally, and that will probably be the end of it. When you call somebody out and you say, listen, we heard that this happened, this is really unacceptable, these are our expectations around that, we can't be tolerating this in the workplace. That should really be the end of it. The other side of this is the more kind of legal approach to this, and that would be filing a complaint with the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal. So the Human Rights Tribunal, they oversee the BC Human Rights Act, and this prevents discrimination in the workplace on a variety of different grounds. There's kind of the classic ones that we all recognize, like age and gender and disability and religion and so on. When it comes to sexual harassment, this specifically deals to discrimination on the basis of gender, where you've got somebody who feels like they're being treated differently because of they're a woman, or because of their sexual orientation, or because of some other protected factor. In those kinds of circumstances, the person can actually go to the tribunal and say that my employer is creating a workplace where I'm being treated differently, a negative treatment to me, and they are either the actors in this, like a supervisor or a manager, or they're condoning it, where they're essentially aware it's happening, but they're allowing my coworkers to do this to me.
Right. A circumstance comes to my mind, not in my workplace, but where you've got a supervisor that gets into a relationship with an underling and then promotes them, and the
Mm-hmm.
people who maybe should have got that promotion are on the sidelines.
Right.
Do they have a complaint?
So this kind of like workplace fraternization, or this kind of, for lack of a better term, almost like a nepotism within the workplace, where there's favoritism towards one
Based
person over another.
on the relationships that are happening. Yeah.
Yeah, so that would be that would, I mean, clearly that's problematic, and clearly this would be really poisonous to like an HR environment, right? So what a lot of companies would do in this case is they may very well have policies around workplace relationships, or they may very well have workplace expectations, like things that need to take place. I'm not necessarily convinced that that would be a complaint under the Human Rights Act. I mean, unless there's like other factors or other facts that we need to have a very close look at. But certainly from a policy perspective, that can be an issue. And one quick comment I would like to just make on this. All workers have contracts with their employer. Now, people think of contract, kind of like a mortgage agreement or something like that, that's 6 pages long and you sign on the last page. And a lot of employees do have those kinds of contracts. But by the same token, a lot of these agreements are implied, which means that they're based on this kind of workplace expectation that they have with their coworkers and their employer, or that can be modified or kind of implied by policies. So if a company has a policy in place that specifically deals with workplace relationships, these are rules that they're putting in place. And if there's a violation of those rules, even with something that is otherwise perfectly legal, there could be some repercussions that flow from that.
So what is I'll do a long-winded question so you can have a nice drink
Sure,
of that
thanks.
water. What would be a typical fraternization policy? I've heard it suggested that if before a relationship happens between any two people for the same company, that they should be reporting to HR.
Yeah.
Which seems a little bit unnatural, but is that a common requirement?
I would say probably not. To be quite honest, like I've been practicing employment law for a number of years now. And I've worked with a lot of companies and I've looked at a lot of different policy manuals. And it's actually quite rare that you'll find a specific policy in place that deals with employee relationships. Unless there's an environment where, perhaps the person's supervisor oversees them, or where there could be a very clear example of the favoritism that you were kind of
But is it
referring
ever
to.
okay for a manager to begin a relationship with someone they manage? And while they're managing other people as well. Is that ever okay?
It's going to really be based on the context and on the workplace. There's nothing inherently wrong with
It's
doing
dangerous, though, isn't it? I mean,
From an HR perspective, absolutely. I mean, it creates risk. There's no question about
It creates
it.
work for your firm.
It can. It certainly can. But is there like a legal rule in place that says that a manager can't date someone that reports to them? Not that I'm aware of. There's no specific rule about that. Now, as I said, the employer may introduce rules for very good reasons. They may say, this is something that we're uncomfortable in the workplace, and this is something that we don't want to be encouraging. Or if this is going to be taking place, we want to be made aware of it so that we can take certain precautions, like, for example, maybe moving person A into department B so that there's no longer that direct report, or so that they can just stay on top of things so that, that home troubles don't translate into workplace troubles, right?
Right.
But
Okay.
just to be very clear on this, there's nothing inherently improper about having a relationship at work, unless the employer has a very clear guidelines in place to say that we're not okay with this, and as a rule of your employment, this won't be taking place.
Right. Before we wrap it up, I want to double back to the harassment thing.
Sure.
What is not okay? Because sometimes harassment can be a little bit subtle, sometimes it's obvious, but
Yeah.
what are the ranges of behaviors that you would classify as harassment?
Okay, very good. So sexual harassment is essentially any unwanted comment or touching or action that's sexual in nature. Now, the problem behind this is that we're no one's mind readers, right? So we can make a joke and it may pass one day, but then somebody else hears this and they get offended by it. And now is this essentially constituting sexual harassment, right? If you make an off-color joke in the workplace. I think there are certainly some things which are fairly clear, right? Unwanted touching of a sexual nature, like where you touch someone's breasts or their behind or something like that. clearly, there's limits of acceptable professional behavior in the workplace. But what about a hug? What about touching somebody on their back? Is that now constitute sexual harassment, right? So one of the things that I like to really focus on here, and this is actually one of my frustrations when I'm trying to defend these cases, is if somebody comes forward and they said, my supervisor made this comment or this joke, and I was humiliated by this and I felt it was totally improper. Well, should we be necessarily jumping right to going to the tribunal about this? Or is this a conversation that we can be having internally to try to resolve this, right? Where we say, yeah, that was improper. That was totally out of line. You know what? And we're on this. We're going to go talk to him about this and make sure that this kind of conduct doesn't happen again. Where the employer essentially assumes some of that responsibility. But then there are, of course, other circumstances where boundaries aren't being respected, where somebody is, continuously leering or making these comments even though they've been cautioned about it, where somebody does make really offhanded jokes on a regular basis, where somebody is exposing their coworkers to pornography in the workplace, which can be a form of sexual harassment because what you're doing is you're creating a different working environment for women than what would be expected from men, right? So all of these things are improper. But again, from an employer's perspective, I think they should be ahead of the curve on this, and they should be having very clear policies and guidance in place as to what is sexual harassment, what do you do if you feel you're the victim of this, or if you see this in the workplace, and having very clear boundaries about other workplace conduct, such as like computer usage.
So with all these sorts of complaints coming forward, though, a person, a male in particular, who goes to work, who's just applying common sense and thoughtfulness, shouldn't necessarily need to worry that there's a new environment that's going to catch them.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I've been reading in the media that there's a lot of men who are very insecure by the Me Too movement and what this means to them, right? Does this mean that I can't compliment a coworker? Does this mean that I can't give them a hug on their birthday? Well, let's let common sense dictate. And I think that is the most reasonable way of looking at this, right? Talk about it. And you know what? And as you mentioned, like if somebody's coming to work with good intentions and they're acting reasonably, I feel there's no reason why there should be any concern.
Right. Terrific. Maybe we'll end it on that. Thanks very much. David Brown from Kent Employment Law, and you're watching Kelowna Now.
Thank you very much.